Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Weuve. I'm here to talk to you about Wargame Pathologies. This is an overview brief that I'm going to give you some examples. It's somewhat idiosyncratic in that way. So let's start off with this title slide. Those are folks at the US Naval War College circa 1910-ish. I got the exact date somewhere. That's in the first or second, I think it's the second building that they did wargaming in there. And they are on a raised platform above the floor. Off to the left, you can't see it. There's some adjudicators that are sitting on basically like a lifeguard chair overlooking it. And they're drawing with chalk on the floor. And they're all wearing three-piece suits. And as a guy who's done some professional gaming, I have been involved in games with three-piece suits. But whenever you show this to people that aren't professional wargamers, the entire idea that you're going to play a game in a three-piece suit, especially one when you're around a lot of chalk, is just sort of like mind-boggling to people. So let's see. Oops, hold on a second. Got to put the cursor in the right place. So I'm a naval analyst and wargame designer and wargame analyst by trade. I got into the business first at the Center for Naval Analysis back in 1999. I stayed at CNA for about 6 years. My boss there was Peter Perla, and I also worked with Al Nofi, names to conjure by. I then went to the US Naval War College, where I was a professor of wargaming for 5 years. That is not nearly as good a job as it sounds like it could be. But while I was there, I was the lead analyst for some interesting events. I was the lead analyst for Global 2008. I was part of something called the Strategic Foundations game, which was this really cool meta game where if you only went to part of it, you thought you were in a workshop. But if you went to multiple parts, you realized that the workshops were actually playing against each other. I also was one of the faculty advisors for Halsey Alpha, which is a faculty-moderated, student-run research group that's been wargaming some interesting Pacific scenarios for close to 20 years now. They started in, I think, 2003, 2002, that time frame. They've done some really cool stuff. I then walked away from wargaming as a job description for a while. I was at the Defense Intelligence Agency. If I told you what I did there, I'd have to kill you. Well, no, actually, I did acquisition threat support for Navy programs. It was, most of my job was actually really, really boring, but there were some cool parts. But all the while, I sort of kept my oar in the water doing gaming stuff, and that's when I started, about the time when I started doing this presentation, because people asked me about my Wargame Pathologies paper, which I'll explain in just a moment, and so I started doing this. Now I work for another part of DoD, but these are my views. I don't speak for any employer, past or present. I am not representing my employer here. I am here all by myself. And I'm here to give an overview of some of the ways that war games can go bad and give you some examples of how war games have gone bad. So, few caveats. These are only my opinions. Like I said, not any employer, past, present, or probably future. It's certainly not the opinion of Goose, because my guess is Sebastian probably has seen this brief before, but we haven't really talked about it, so it's certainly not the opinion of Goose, unless it just happened to get lucky. I will also say where you sit is where you stand. In other words, I've had certain experiences, and those are going to come through in a lot of my examples that I give. And those experiences have sort of, they've shaped my perception about how all this stuff works. That is totally natural. That is the nature of experience. Your mileage may vary, but one of the things I'm here to tell you is that if you are in professional wargaming, you will run into incidents like this. And a lot of the incidents that I detail here, some of them are very public and people have heard them, and you get a different perspective if you're in the business than if you're outside of the business on that. And that's one of the things that I like about coming and talking to Goose, is that I know that while I see a lot of names I recognize, and a lot of these folks are colleagues, some of whom I've known for 20+ years, on the flip side, I know that there's probably some new people that are thinking about wargaming, and I want to share some of that experience with you. I'm mostly going to focus on analytical type games, because that's the sort of stuff that I've done over the course of my career. I've done very little in the training and education market. I've done a few things here and there, but they were mostly along the periphery. So most of my examples are from the analytic type stuff. This is an overview. You could write an entire book on this. I'd like to at some point. It's all based upon this paper I wrote at CNA that I'll talk about on the next slide, or a couple of slides from now. And it's got a lot more detail in it, but I've only got an hour. I could literally talk about this for 10 hours if I had to. It's not really about how to design a game, but if you don't think about how games can fail, you're going to end up with designs that are going to fail. So it's not really a primer on how to design a game, but it's all the other stuff that you should know about while you're designing, right? So it's certainly a related topic. And this brief has changed over the years. I've put the hood up on it fairly recently and made a lot of additions to it and changed a few things and reworded some things. And I don't consider it done because I'm back in the wargaming business full time. And being in the wargaming business means that I'm having more and more opportunities to discover ways that wargames can go bad. So next, let me give you an outline. Hold on a second. There we go. An outline of where I'm going to go. So first, an introduction. We're almost done with it. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the background of the project that led to this and the methodology that I'll use. Then I'll go through the elements of the game, which is basically the methodology. And then after I do a very brief bit on that, I'll do a deeper dive on all those elements and talk to you about what pathologies are associated with each one. Like I said, big overview. I'm not diving into all the ways it can fail, but I'm trying to give you an example, at least one example for every major area of how they can fail. Then I'm going to offer you some thoughts on distributed wargaming. And by that, I mean like wargaming over the internet, etc. When you take a professional game and you convert it to something you have to do online, it gets complicated. But it's something that I and my fellow professional wargamers we're living the dream right now because of COVID. And then I've got a few concluding thoughts on that. So this all started with a paper that I wrote as part of the Transforming Naval Wargaming project at the Center for Naval Analysis back in 2004. So this was, CNA was working for the Naval War College on this project with Stephen Downs Martin and Barney Rubel and a whole bunch of people that ended up being my colleagues when they recruited me to go there like about a year after this, a little bit less than that. 7 months later, I was working up in Newport. And as part of that, there had been this discussion about Wargame Pathologies, and I decided it was worth doing a paper. So I suggested to Peter, let me do a paper as part of this project. And that's what we ended up doing. And I was the principal author of it. So when I was sort of trying to get my arms around how to do this, it's like, well, how do you talk about this subject? And I finally decided that the right answer, as is so often the case in writing papers like this, is that you find a particular framework that works for some other thing, and then you talk about, I'm talking about how a game could go bad, so the right place to start, I thought, was what's a game? And what are the pieces of the game? So I went back to Peter Perla's 1990 book, The Art of Wargaming, where he talks about the elements of a war game. But he's only really talking about the stuff you need to make a game happen from the game perspective, the parts that you have to design. He's not really talking about the other things that have to happen, like the facilities, etc. So I added those in because you can have problems from what we'd call in Newport a wedding planning prospect, right? You can plan the event wrong, you can have the facility that's too small or something like that. Those things are important too, although they're not strictly part of the game. So the end result of this was a paper that is really the thing that I'm best known for in the wargaming community. It's the thing I keep getting called back to talk about. It's the thing people keep asking me to do. I've given this lecture to classes. I've done it to the Military Operations Research Society 2 or 3 times. I've done it at the Connections Conference 2 or 3 times. And it's funny because I keep getting asked to give the same briefing over again to a group that I've already given it before, which I think is very flattering. So part of today's talk is going to be a talk about how the sausage gets made. And what I mean by that is it's not an abstract discussion of gaming. It's going to show you, since it's showing you the way it can go wrong, it's showing you how to deal with things when it goes wrong. And some of the ways that it can go wrong are kind of messy. And the solutions end up being kind of messy. And so the end result of that is that, there are places where you go, that's not the way I would like that to work. And I will be the first person to agree with you. It's not the way that we want this to work sometimes. Sometimes you have your choices are, you're sort of between a rock and a hard place, and your goal is to pick the least bad option that gets you to a conclusion. And so that's how this sometimes works. I've already said that it's not an exhaustive examination of this. I keep repeating that because it's not an exhaustive. If you want something that's more exhaustive, go and look at the paper. Although I will admit the paper's incomplete at this point, because I then went off to Newport and discovered a bunch of new pathologies that needed to get put back in the paper. So at some point I want to basically redo that paper. I'm going to give you some real world examples. All of them, I know for a fact that all of them are real, except one. There's two that I was not part of. One of them may be apocryphal, but it gets the point across. But all the other ones, I could tell you the names of the people involved, but I'm generally not going to do that unless the person is me, just because a lot of people end up not coming out smelling like roses. Also, these aren't examples of pure pathologies. I mean, it's not just in any given instance that only one thing went wrong. Because a lot of times the boundaries between these things are not real clear. They're not real crystal. A lot of times you can look at it and go, well, okay, you put it in that category, but it could also be in this category, to which I say, yeah, you're right. You're right. Breaking the different parts of a war game down and sort of saying these are the elements of a war game, there are places where that differentiation is kind of artificial. And that's okay, right? Because the purpose of that model is to promote understanding. It's not that, you're not going to get it wrong somehow. It's if you come away understanding how a war game works after you've looked at that model, then it served its purpose. If you come away understanding how to think about pathologies and how to prevent them from having gone through this model with me tonight or having read the paper, then we've accomplished our goal in all of this. Okay, so, oops, I think I went too far. There we go. All right, so let's talk about the elements of a war game from the art of wargaming. So Peter originally had 7 elements. There were the core game elements, the objectives, the scenario, the database, the models, the rules and procedures, and the players, as he put it. And then he also talked about analysis, because if you don't actually have the analysis, then you wasted your time doing the game. And more importantly, if you're trying to do analysis, that should affect your game design, because you need to be generating data, right? You can't analyze data that you don't generate. You can't generate data that you haven't set up as part of, the objective has to be to generate the data, right? And so as a result of that, you have to think about analysis at the very beginning of the process. And if you're really doing it right, your lead analyst at the very least is part of the war game design team. So I started with those game elements, but then I realized a few things. First of all, is that there's types of participants that Peter doesn't talk about. He doesn't talk about the designers and the analysts as a source of pathologies, because designers and analysts are human. They're subject to all the foibles of being human, foibles of perspective and bias and being overworked and political pressures and all the rest of it, so they can fail too. It doesn't talk about the culture and environment in which war games are planned and executed in. One of the things I'm going to say on that slide is that a war game is a political act. And it may not matter much as a political act, like if you're designing a commercial game, or it may matter a great deal, but it's a political act in the most broad sense of that term. I'm a poli-sci historian type by training, and so I have a tendency to think of everything as being at least partially a political act. But the important thing is that you cannot divorce the war game, especially a professional war game, from the politics of the organization that sponsors it and executes it. It's part of that process. And you need to understand that in order to do it successfully. The audience, and those are the people that aren't a participant, but they still care about it, and they're still gonna, they're still gonna pay attention to the results. Those people have an effect on it, and they can have a distorting effect on it. And finally, the executing authorities, which is sort of, you could say that they're a special type of audience, but that basically boils down to, even the organizations that are responsible for putting the game on have their own failure modes, and it's worth talking about them as well. Okay. All right. So, did I skip one? I skipped one. Sorry about that. Did I skip one? There we go. All right. So what do I mean by objectives? The objectives are simply what the sponsor is trying to get out of the game. So they're usually, they may start in the form of questions, but they drive data collection. They're the reason at core, they're the analytic questions as to why you're doing a game. If you're doing an educational game, the objective may be, we want to teach them X, or we want to train them in X. It can either be teaching or training, depending. Those are two different things. As a general rule, they should follow the SMART guidelines. They should be specific, measurable, actionable, relevant, and time-related. So you need to be, if you word them that way, you probably have a better objective than if you don't word them that way. They need to be explicitly agreed to by the sponsor. So sometimes what happens is the sponsor will throw out a bunch of big picture ideas, but then they don't really, they leave it to you to refine them, right? And they need to be refined if they're going to be useful for anybody. You need to be able to sort of, to specifically get down to the meat of it, because you're going to design a game to do that. One of the many possible failure modes is having a preordained outcome. And by that, I mean the sponsor is trying to use the game to prove something that they've already decided on. Now, there's a specific game that I was involved with, and in that case, there was a fake objective to analyze the topic, but the real unspoken objective that it was pretty clear the sponsor had was to support a pet rock that they had already agreed upon. So I was the lead Naval War College analyst on this particular project. It was a weird project in that we were not really the people designing and executing the game. We were hosting it, and as a result of hosting it, there was a War College person on the design staff, and I was there as the War College analyst, but I was told originally that my sum total analytic input was going to be to read the report that somebody else wrote and give it a thumbs up or thumbs down. Now, we're going to come back to this story later because that's not what happened. But I ended up being told that I was going to have to write a report at the last minute. I'll tell you later about how I kind of lucked out and did the right thing by accident, and that wasn't as bad as it could have been. But there was a lot of things about this game that were just broken, just plain broken. And so I went to my Naval War College colleague and said, you know what, we've been dealing with this shit all this time, and we've been totally and completely ignored, and this never should have happened because officially our policy is that we don't support other people's games. We don't host for other people. And so I'm going to speak truth to power. I'm going to lay out exactly how broken this all is. Yeah. That was not met with a groundswell of enthusiasm from my colleague. And my colleague said to me, and this is as verbatim as I can remember this conversation, he said, Chris, you can't do that, they'll crucify me. And I said, what do you mean you were given the responsibility without the authority they can't blame you for this. And his response was, do you think that's going to matter? So he was right. It wouldn't matter. And so now I'm put in a quandary where I know that this thing is not our finest moment. I know that it's not the finest moment for us, particularly in the wargaming department of the Naval War College, and it's not the finest moment for the people who put my colleague and I in this position. It's not the finest moment for professional wargamers everywhere. I got to write a report. It's now gained attention at the very highest levels of the War College. And, you know, potentially this could have job repercussions for my colleague and I. And I was more worried about the colleague than I was me, because I was kind of thinking that I was probably going to pull the handles and leave that place. But he was, you know, he wasn't anywhere near the point where he was going to retire out of that place, and he had a few years left to go. So what I ended up doing was writing a report that, if you read it really carefully, there was one and only one conclusion that the War College actually signed up for. And that conclusion was that the sponsor liked the game. Everything else in that report was a quote from the sponsor. Everything else in the conclusion section was a quote from the sponsor. Most of it was from the slide deck that the sponsor had created before the war game was executed, talking about how great the war game was and how the war game proved that that pet rock was the right answer before the war game had been executed. And so I just quoted the sponsor, included his slides, said, you know, as the good captain says, blah, 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 here we go. So this is preferentially not the way you want to do this, right? I am not advocating that this is, you know, this is the way that it should work. In a perfect world, and what I know now, what I learned from this experience, is I should have gone up the chain of command and said, no, we shouldn't be doing this. Our own policy says we're not going to do this, you know, blah, 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 you know, given all the reasons, you know, they're totally ignoring us. We're getting outvoted and all this other stuff. The contractor is getting his way on everything we're doing. And we all know, everybody, you know, we know that this is wrong, and this is going to come back to haunt us. So boss, you know, first of all, you need to know this is going on. Second of all, you need to stop it. And third, if you're not willing to stop it, I want explicit instructions from you on how to handle it. But by the time I realized that this is the situation that we were in, it was too late. This ball was in my court, and I had to solve the problem. And this is the solution I came up with. So not the finest moment, but you know, I'll admit, I am really, really perversely proud of this report. Of all the different products I produced while I was in Newport, there are two that stand out. One is the unpublished report for the Strategic Foundations game and all the different pieces that went through it. I wrote a report that never got published, but I put my heart and soul into that. And the other one was figuring out how to handle this really, really icky problem and being able to make it work. So that's it for objectives. Let's talk about scenario. The scenario in a war game is what covers the context for decision making. So quick sidebar, would somebody please tell me in chat that you can still hear me, because I haven't seen anything pop up in chat in a while. So the scenario sets the context for decision making. It should, good to hear, thank you folks. It should include the beginning state, the desired end state, and the player's mission that they're going to accomplish, right? So it basically describes the world they're living in and what the world looks like at the beginning and what they want the world to look like at the end. You know, so what the victory condition looks like is really part of that scenario. And it sort of describes the world. And scenario, incidentally, is a word that comes from from stage acting, actually. The scenario is basically the scene setter for all that. So this is the scene setter for your game. One failure mode for a scenario is not being specific enough in the political consequences that you're aiming for at the end. If you're too narrowly focused in what you want, then sometimes players will, you know, it turns out that there's parts of the scenario that weren't really delineated, but they're there because otherwise it would be bad, and they're not paying attention to it. Now, this particular case may be apocryphal, but I think it's such a good example that I like running with it anyway. And this is one that I heard. I think it may have occurred up in Newport, because that's where I heard the story, where supposedly this student was running roughshod. It was in a standard U.S. Soviet Cold War type thing, and he was, you know, doing everything he could to beat the Russians, but in the process, he was basically trouncing all over our allies in the process. And the end result of this was that he created some real problems for NATO in the game, because he wasn't taking into account any of the allies, and the allies were getting really pissed, and he wasn't really doing leadership. And, you know, you shouldn't have to tell somebody that, you know, don't destroy NATO. One of your goals is to not destroy NATO, right? But on the other hand, this is a student, right? And so, you know, okay, not a college student. This is a naval officer probably. So maybe you don't need to get that specific. But it sort of highlights the idea that it highlights what's actually a real question behind this. And that real question is, what are you trying to get a handle on here, right? What do you need to do to win in a game like this, especially like these big, you know, existential Cold War type war games? What are you actually going to need to do to win? And if the answer is that you're going to have to do something that sort of goes beyond the sort of normal state of this, that's something you probably want to write down, right? That's probably something worth reporting on after the fact, if it's an analytic event. And incidentally, that's one of the reasons why traditionally those big Cold War era war games, existential war games, were for US nationals only. Foreign nationals weren't generally allowed to participate. And in part, that's because, you know, potentially it might be part of the scenario that you're allowed to go down some paths just to see where they go. And, you know, you don't necessarily want our allies seeing how the sausage is made. Now, lest anyone think that, you know, I just gave away something, they do the same thing, right? I used to be, there are times in my past when I've been the US head of delegation for something where I've met with the Five Eye partners. And I remember in one of these, the lead Brit, we were sort of, you know, dancing around something. And he just said, look, we all have national goals. We all have stuff we're not going to share with everybody else. Let's just acknowledge that and move on. We don't have to pretend that we don't show everything to everybody. We all know that this is the case. And it's like, I'm really glad he said that, because it sort of cleared the air, and we had a very frank discussion after that. So Sarah asked the question, do you ever feel that like game designers are trying to get the players to write their own scenario? And the answer is, yeah, sometimes that kind of happens, but in general, I think that that's most likely to happen if the game designers haven't thought it all the way through. If that's actually one of the things they're trying to do is have the players design their scenario. I mean, that's an intriguing idea for a game, of having the players create the scenario as part of the game. And if you're trying to do that, you should be upfront about that. Now, for what it's worth, I've actually done some serious thinking about a game where the players are trying to create the scenario for another game. And there's a simple role-playing game called, no, it's not universalis. It's called microscope. It's called microscope, where it's basically about the players are designing the story as they go along. And microscope is an utterly fascinating idea to me, because it occurs to me that in certain situations, you could conceivably have this as the game that is played by the design staff to design the scenario that's then executed for other people to play. Now, I will note, before anybody gets totally and completely liquored up on this idea, I will note that, you know, the important thing about this is that you're following the objectives, right? The objectives really need to determine where you're going to go in your game design, right? And so the scenario is designed to follow those objectives, to meet those objectives. So that's the more important thing about the scenario than being realistic. It's that the scenario has to channel play towards a location where you're doing the things that the objectives need you to do to create the data that's later going to be analyzed, or to create the learning experience that the players need to have, right? Usually the right answer is you want something as realistic as possible, because if it's not realistic as possible, especially in a professional environment, people have a tendency to drop out of their suspension of disbelief, right? It's less real to them, and you want it to be as real as possible. But it, you know, I've had this idea of microscope in my back pocket for like 15 years now, because I think that there might be a there. I haven't yet encountered the situation where I'm going to pull it out, but I've got it there in case I need it. I see that a couple of people actually know about Microscope. Yeah, it's Microscope by Ben Robbins. It's sort of funny. There's two different games I know where it's all about creating the player, creating the story along. Microscope is a game about creating societies and big picture, etc. There's another game called Universalis that is about creating a story for individual players. So the big picture game is named Microscope. The little picture game is named Universalis. Okay, I really think those two guys should get together and swap names. Okay, so let's talk about the database some. The database is all the quantitative information used by the players and controllers to make decisions and as inputs to the models. So it's not the equations that govern how these things interact. That's the model, right? It's not the sort of, it might be somewhat qualitative information, but I'm really talking about things like the order of battle, right? And so, like I said earlier, these things kind of bleed over. Isn't the order of battle part of the scenario? Well, yeah, yes and no. Okay, you can sort of separate them. It's useful to think of the database as being sort of quantitatively different, because you can have the scenario created like, you know, I'm borrowing from these sources for the scenario, and for the database, you know, I might use James, I might use Periscope, I might use some classified thing, et cetera, et cetera. So, okay, that's a good way to sort of bin them separately. One of the failure modes about this is that the information is insufficient to support the player or controller decisions. The players are going to try to do stuff, and they're going to use the stuff in the database to do it. And the controllers are going to try to adjudicate stuff, and they need to use the stuff in the database in order to do that. And if your database doesn't support those things, then you might have problems. So I'm going to give you an example that I wasn't actually there for, but I have talked to a lot of people. I've read a lot of articles about it, but I've talked to a lot of people who were there. And I've generally gotten positive feedback from all the people who were there about how I put all this together. So here's what I'm going to tell you about Millennium Challenge 02. A lot of you have heard of Millennium Challenge 02. This is the one where General Paul Van Riper was the head red. And as head red, Van Riper had been involved in this process for a long time. Now, Millennium Challenge 02 was huge. It was like $250 million. Yes, billion with a B, $250 million for this war game. It was humongous. They combined it with exercise stuff. They were spread out over multiple sites. So you had real forces moving to do pieces of it. You had big iron computers doing this and that and the other thing, et cetera, et cetera. It was one of those too big to fail type efforts. And that's always dangerous when you've created something like that. huge, huge political footprint. And we were going to look at some of the things that could define the US military for the next 50 years. Always dangerous. General Van Riper had been part of this process for a while. Van Riper was a retired Marine general, somewhat of an iconoclast. He did not like where he saw this going. He thought that, and he was bringing up concerns about what the U.S. was going to do, and he thought that good Marines, good U.S. servicemen were going to get killed if they followed this, if people didn't start paying attention to what he saw as all the problems in all this. So he agreed to be head red in this event. I think this was a case of you'd rather have him inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in, but I don't know that for a fact. They made him head red, and he decided that he was going to prove that this didn't work. Now, this is one of those games that had hundreds of objectives, I'm sure. Generally, if you've got more than about 5 objectives, I don't believe it, and 5 is really pushing it. I've seen games where they literally had like 60 main objectives, and then each one had 5 sub-objectives. Those are all real problematic when you try to do that. There's lots of failure modes associated with that. And in this particular case, it was one of these huge events where they were trying to prove everything. And in this particular case, General Van Riper decided that it was his job to protect Americans and protect America, that he was going to throw a monkey wrench into this. And so he pulled out every trick in the book. Instead of using radios, he had his guys use motorcycle messengers, and he equipped, they were doing a straits transit at one point, moving ships through a narrow body of water. And he had guys on jet skis firing rocket-propelled grenades and all this other stuff. Well, none of these things were in the database that the adjudicators were using. None of them. And Van Riper hadn't told the adjudicators that he was going to go off script in this. He just decided to do it. He basically ended up conducting a denial of service attack on the White Cell. And the White Cell did the best that they could for as long as they could. But the problem is that the White Cell's essentially making it up as they go along, and that's a problem. And like, for one of the things I heard was that for that RPG, which has like a 7-pound warhead, they picked the smallest warhead they had in their database, which was like an Exocet, which is like a 200-pound warhead. And guess what? It turned out to be really effective. Way more effective than guys on jet skis firing RPGs would be in the real world. And motorcycle messengers, there's a reason why we don't use motorcycle messengers. There's a reason why we use radios. But it's really easy to say these things work when you haven't actually done any research on them. It's, a lot of that research, it's easy to say, I'm going to invent this thing and it's going to be great. A lot of professional knowledge about a topic like that is knowing the ways that it doesn't work. And they got tossed in with a whole bunch of stuff that they were going to have to do on the fly. What really should have happened is Van Riper should have gone to the White Cell and said, here's what I'm intending to do. And if they said no, then he can walk, right? Then he can walk. Because the purpose of this game is to meet a certain set of objectives. The red cell is a creature of the White Cell. The blue cell is a creature of the White Cell. The White Cell is responsible for making sure the objectives are met. I'm not saying that they should queer the game. I'm not saying that they should, cook the books. What I'm saying is that they, if you've accepted that your role is to be part of this, there's a responsibility that comes along with it. And you should do what you can to meet your responsibilities. I'll have more on that later. So let's see, next thing is, let's talk a little bit about the models. Models are basically the representation of the world. It's what you're dumping the data into to get results out of. They're usually mathematical expressions or lookup tables or formulas or whatever, and they can be either implemented manually or via computer. It can be as simple as a guy saying, yeah, you know what, 3 to 1, yeah, okay, that's good for manually adjudicated stuff, or it can be more complicated than that. It's for those of us that do professional stuff, it's usually about trying to represent the real world at some level of fidelity. All models are wrong. Some models are useful. This is definitely the case. I'll note that, and this is something that I've added because I've been doing a lot of thinking of it regard to distributed wargaming, is that this includes communication channels. Every time a player talks to another player, and in the real world, they wouldn't be working for the same organization and be in the same room. That's a model of a real world communication process, whether you have thought of it that way or not. And so when you go distributed, you need to take that into account, right? We cheat a lot by the fact that we never need to think about how people are going to talk. They just walk into another room and they talk. And a lot of things that happen with guys just looking at a map and having a conversation, that in the real world, it doesn't work that way. And if you're doing the game distributed, it can no longer really work that way. So that's a little preface of what I'm going to talk about later. One failure mode you might have here is that the models are too complex to actually be used during the game. When I was at CNA, we did a war game where we were one of the people that were, one of the groups that were doing this game, not the senior group, unfortunately. We were supporting somebody else. And they wanted to use this 80-page spreadsheet model that would give you results to 4 decimal points. It took into account everything you needed to know about building ships, and like the inflation rate and the steel production in the world at that point, and labor relations and budgeting stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And they wanted to use it because if they got it in the game, which this was sort of the prototype game, then as this game was executed it was intended to be a training game, as it got executed over and over again, they'd have to be part of the contract in order to, and they'd get, because it's a proprietary model. This was way above and beyond what we needed, but we couldn't convince them not to use it. And so we ended up using this game. Now, this particular model failed for 2 reasons. First of all, it's doing everything to 4 decimal places. And all of the inputs are people going, hey, Bob, how much do you think that would cost? Maybe $1 million? I'll put down 2 million just to be sure. So it's doing 4 decimal places, and all the inputs are like order of magnitude estimates. You know, you could also say this is a database problem, right? Because nobody had the data on how these things are actually going to cost, what they're actually going to cost. The other bit about that is that there was a fundamental math error made on the lead designer for this, which is it went like this. You got 3 teams. Each team's going to take 15 minutes to run their stuff through the model, hour-long turns, 15 minutes to spare. What's the problem with that? Well, the schedule didn't stagger when people had to turn their turns in. Basically, people got an hour to do their planning, and then they turned it in. So they did their hour's worth of planning, and then like at the 55-minute mark, everybody turned in their turn. And now that 45-minute clock starts from the 5 minutes and counting mark, from T-minus 5 minutes. And so the first turn was about 40 minutes late, and then you got to get everything back, et cetera, et cetera. We ended up executing about half the number of turns that we thought we were going to execute in that game as a result of that. This is probably something that this should have been seen in advance. If we had been the prime on this, I'm sure that we would never have done this if we had been the prime. But as it was, we weren't. Other people made that decision, and I just wish we had taken popcorn to the game, because there was all sorts of things like that in the game. It would have been great to just sit back and eat some popcorn and watch it. Next is rules and procedures. So that's basically how you do all the interactions in the game, not the interactions themselves, that's the model, but it's all the rules on how people do stuff. And that includes things like the sequence of play, which I just gave you an example, the sequence of play being jacked up. It's how you're going to do adjudication. It's how the models and databases are going to be used. In some cases, you look at it and you go, I don't need to actually use that. I'm just going to, I'm going to do it some other way. A friend of mine, Paul Weber, once showed up for a global, and he had his binder full of stuff that he was going to use to adjudicate. And the lead adjudicator just basically was doing adjudication off the top of his head, because Paul didn't understand that the objectives of the war game didn't require a binder full of tables. It required tossing up things it was basically batting practice for blue. throwing some weird pitches at them, see how they're doing, etc. But you're using the results of the game to sort of queue up the blue people, to the blue cell, to do things that you can collect the data on. So sometimes the rules and procedures say you only use the model when you need to. Sometimes the rules and procedures say, that result doesn't help. I rolled 3 6s. That result doesn't help. I need something that's like more mainstream, more in the center. This is something that players in Newport red players everywhere find out all the time, that they're one of the reasons why they're not a free agent. They think they're a free agent and they're not. So I was involved in a couple of games up in Newport that had some seriously unrealistic schedules and rules problems. One was I was part of a game that had 7-minute turns. And that's because it was a new game designer, great guy, kind of inexperienced. He needed to get through X number of turns, and his solution was to make very short turns. If your turn can be screwed up by somebody getting coffee or going to the bathroom, your turn is too short. And he learned that really quick. That game went off the rails from a schedule perspective very early on. He ended up, he had to get together with the sponsor. They called an audible when they realized that, we're not going to do these in 7 minutes. This part that we thought was a 7-minute thing is really like a 30-minute thing. Fastest we can do is 30 minutes. And they had to sort of rejigger it on the fly, and it ended up being a very useful game that they've repeated multiple times afterwards. But a more experienced designer wouldn't have gone with 7-minute turns. There was a game that I was a participant in, and I'm going to toot my own horn. It'll even out later on when I give you another example. This was a game as part of the instructions up at the War College. It was a game where the Navy's selling the island of Vieques, which is this island that the Navy used for target practice. It was a gunnery range, and there was political pressure to sell it, and the game was all about selling Vieques. And in this particular game, each of the cells are trying to maximize their payoff according to a personalized set of objectives. So like the Navy cell was trying to maximize the amount of money they were getting. The environmental cell was trying to protect some turtles, and these guys are trying to do this. And they got a payoff based upon that. And basically you had to create a 5-point plan. Each of the different 5 points had 4 different options underneath it, and you got a payoff for each of those options based upon what got picked. And in some cases you got 0, and in others you might get a lot of money. A lot of points. And so the big stumbling block in all of this was that there was this one cell that had a set of constraints on it, a payoff chart that looked totally unlike everybody else's payoff chart. And they had veto authority over any plan that they were part of. And so I was the first one to realize. I was paired with a Navy SEAL, and we had kind of decided, you know what, this isn't going to work. We were the tree huggers. We were the environmental group, and we had no leverage whatsoever. And we thought, we're doomed. And then we realized that there was this hole in the payoff chart, that if we just simply excluded the one cell from the final plan, everybody else could come really close to maximizing their payoff. And so I started working the room. I'd go around and say, how about such and such? It's like, yeah, but the telecommunications company is never going to buy that. I'd point to the board where the vetoes were written up. Say, we won't put them as part of it. We'll leave them out of it. They won't be able to use a veto. And so basically I orchestrated the situation where we were able to maximize this. And we even went so far as to make the telecommunications company pay for it, because that was an option, even though they weren't part of the plan. And I did that specifically because the US Naval War College has a wargaming department that is designed to help the instructors. Part of our job description is when we get a request from the teaching side, we help them design war games. And none of them were bothered to talk to the wargaming department. So I felt a personal responsibility to show them the error of their ways, and I did that by driving a truck right through the middle of their war game. I later found out that they changed the rules of the war game. You know that you've had real impact in a professional war game if they have to change the rules to prevent you from doing it again. That applies to commercial war games too. So now let's talk about participants. There's lots of different types of participants. You got players, you got controllers, you got observers, you've got subject matter experts. All of these players are creatures of the white cell in that they're all there for a reason. The white cells, they're responsible for making sure the game objectives are being met. You know, I've already given you that talk. I should also say on this slide that all of the players are human beings who can become distracted or bored or may not want to be there, but were told to be there by their boss, or have an agenda that they're more concerned about than the play of your war game. All of those things are true. So the failure modes are, that I want to talk about tonight are you got the wrong player for the job or players having their own agenda. So these are fairly short. The first one is, I was involved with a game at CNA. We were down, we were executing the game. I'm a controller for a cell, I'm there. And one of the players raises his hand and he says, "You forgot somebody." And I said, "What?" "Yeah, such and such an agency would be all over this. It was a state agency. Never heard of it before. They would be key players in this." Oh shit. We don't have anybody here from there. They're not included in the game. All right, command decision time. I said to the guy, because he was there with a partner, right? So there were two guys from his agency. I said, "Could you play those guys?" Sort of looked at me and said, yeah, I guess I could. "All right, you're it. You're write that on your name tag. You're now this guy." Okay. And then I found the game director and said, "Hey, Ed, guess what? I just called an audible in your game design and added a player," and explained to him what happened. And he said, "Good job, go forth and do good work." Second one was something I saw up in Newport. There was an admiral and his staff that were playing blue. And they did some stuff that was interesting. Not as effective as we would like to have seen. It was by the book, but it wasn't as effective as we would like to have seen. And they did it again and again and again. They just kept doing it again. And I came away going, this guy's an idiot. How'd this guy make admiral? And I didn't figure this out myself. I had to be told this. I had to figure it out having a conversation with somebody else about it, because this guy, a friend of mine, was just singing this admiral's praises. And I said, "Yeah, but I saw him in Newport," and and I told him the story. And he goes, "Dude, you're not getting it. He wasn't playing your game. He was training his staff." Oh shit. That's exactly what he was doing. He was getting ready to deploy. He was getting ready to take a carrier battle group to sea. He had a lot bigger fish to fry than some game in Newport. And so he was training his staff on what didn't work. Now, it would have been nice if we had known that. Would have been nice if they had told us that. I didn't write the report that time. I don't remember if the report actually, if anybody in the analysis cell picked up on the fact that that's what's going on, but that was clearly what was going on. And it would have been nice if he would have told us in advance, right? Like he's a creature of the white cell. It would have been nice if he told us in advance. But admirals get to sort of make their own rules. I already told you the story. Actually, I told you part of the story. Back in that game with the 80-page spreadsheet, one of the players in that game was a savvy operator, a really savvy operator. And he realized that, he later said, the key to being a program manager is to assume that everybody works for you. And he realized that as these requests for information were coming in the real world, he would task other people to provide him with stuff. He wouldn't be responding to these directly. I mean, he'd be responding to them, but he'd say, all right, you wanted an analysis of alternatives. I had CNA do analysis of alternatives. Here it is. And so his policy was for every request that came into the white cell, from the white cell, he sent out 5 requests for information to the white cell. He conducted a denial of service attack on the white cell, which is sort of kind of what Van Riper did too. Denial of service attacks on the white cell are a common player tactic if they think that they can win that way. And so you ended up with a table full of white cell people of whom they're all responding to taskers that came from other people at the table. You should specifically design your game so that this does not happen. You should be aware that this can happen, and you should step in to prevent it from happening if you ever see it happening. It was very amusing to watch it happen. If you want to see a pretty good examination of all the different ways that players can go bad, you really need to look at Rules of Play by Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman. It's a fantastic book. It came out 2004-ish, I think. 2003, 2004, something like that. Very small print. It was a textbook. You're going to look at it and you're going to go, this is absolutely nothing about professional game design. It's not about war game design. I mean, they spend an inordinate amount of time talking about tic-tac-toe. Trust me, read the book. It should be like your 3rd book on game design. It shouldn't be the 1st book, it shouldn't be the 2nd book, but it should be your 3rd book on game design, and it will tell you if you play your game and all the rules work, but it's not fun, this is the book that could go a long way towards telling you why it's not fun, and it also tells you the way the players can screw up your game. All right, so let's look at infrastructure. This is facilities, supplies, hardware, software, all the different things you need to do to make the game that aren't actually the game itself. And the failure mode here is just simply, you need to have a plan B in all of this, right? You need to be in a situation where if there's an infrastructure failure, you can recover from it. And the first one I can tell you about is in Global 2007, 2008, not the same globals with the Admiral, the one before that. The lead analyst was not paying attention when he was copying files from one location to another and accidentally deleted 3 hours worth of data. So that lead analyst was me. The good news in all of that is because I didn't trust the infrastructure, all that stuff had first been put on sheets of paper and then had been input into the computer. As a general rule, you want to avoid anything where you directly input stuff into a computer, because unless your execution depends on the computer itself, and as a result, if the computer goes down your host anyway. And that's because computers don't scale. You got to have a person sitting in the chair. And if that person gets swamped, it just translates into time. Whereas if you've got like a move form and the players are generating moves faster than you can track them, you can just have, multiple players can fill out move forms, and then you can always input them later, but you've got it captured. And you can always have the adjudication cell stay late. You do a turn in the morning, they don't get lunch. You do a turn in the afternoon, they don't get dinner either. Maybe they're there until midnight. It's part of that's what you sign up to if you're in the white cell. But if you've got it on paper, you don't have to worry about, like, what if we have a power outage? What if the idiot lead analyst deletes the stuff, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a way to solve it. There was one other time I was going to do this war game on a destroyer, and it's just me and the independent duty corpsman, and I've got this Palm Pilot that we're going to leave behind with him, and the Palm Pilot's got some software on predicting disease. And it's basically, it's a diagnostic tool thing. And there's a specific scenario, and I won't get into the details of the scenario other than to say there were reasons why we expected in this scenario that there would be disease on the ship. You can fill in the rest. And so the software isn't quite ready. The database isn't ready yet. So they decide, okay, what we'll do is we'll send you out to the ship, and then we'll email you this database, and you can put it onto the Palm Pilot and hand it to the independent duty corps. Okay, roger that. I get out to the ship. Very first thing, I ask the XO, I say, hey, I'm going to need to get online. send from your account or from somebody's account. We need to send a message ashore saying, hey, send the data back here. And the answer is, yeah, our NIPRNet connection is down. It's been down for a week. That's the unclassified internet connection. Oh, okay. Now, luckily, they had pushed me out several days in advance because of the vagaries of scheduling the airline that is an aircraft carrier. I'm on a destroyer, but I had to go out to the aircraft carrier, and I had to go out like 5 days early because that's the only way they can make the schedule work. And so I've got time. And so every day I ask the XO, how's it doing? How's it doing? How's it doing? Finally, he says, yeah, they told us we're making it worse and we should quit trying to fix it. Okay, so I can't lead the independent duty corpsman through this scenario because I don't know enough about disease to fake it. He's the subject matter expert. I'm not. So it's like, okay, what am I going to do for plan B? So in this case, I invented a plan B on the spot. And I said, you know what? All right, here's what the scenario would have been. Here's exactly what was going to happen. So let's walk through it day by day and have you tell me about the sort of things that you would do. And then we're going to do a complete inventory of your relevant medicine. And so we did all that. And what was going to be like a 4-day, 3-day event ended up being a 2-hour event. And I captured all the data on the medicine. And we found out that they were cross-decking some meds. Because he was saying things like, normally I'd have 200 pills of this, I've only got 20. Normally I'd have 50 pills of this, I've only got 3. Normally, et cetera, because they were, just like they move missiles from ship to ship as they get ready to deploy, they move medicine from ship to ship. And the Lant Fleet Surgeon General said that piece of information justified the cost of sending your guy out there for a week and having him live on the ship for a week, because she had no idea that that's what they were doing. And that got the idea across. So totally plan B, totally didn't do what we were originally going to do, still provided a meaningful impact to the sponsor in the end. Let's talk about analysts. Or the analyst process, not analysts per se. That analysis is the process whereby game experiences are turned into useful knowledge, both in terms of what happened during the game and what the outcomes were. A real failure mode here is having a lack of an analysis plan. You need to do the analysis plan in advance. You need to have the lead analyst be part of the game design process. That game design needs to provide data for the analysis plan to do the analysis, right? If you can't analyze data that you don't generate, you can't generate data that's not part of the game. And so you need to have all that stuff done in advance. So that game I talked about, the one where I wanted to speak truth to power and then didn't, I was told that I was never going to have to write an analysis plan for that. I was just going to have to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And that changed because the politics of the situation changed. And the boss's boss decided that I was going to have to write an analysis plan. And he told me that the game started at noon on Monday. It ended at noon on Friday. All of Friday morning was out briefs, so the game really ended in prep for out briefs. So the game really ended like sort of late Thursday afternoon. He told me this at 4 o'clock on Wednesday. I didn't have an analysis plan. I didn't have a data collection plan. I didn't instrument the game to collect data because I wasn't going to have to do any of that stuff. Luckily for me, what I did have was a bunch of people that I had invited to a game from a neighboring command, a couple of neighboring commands, because it was about a topic that they cared deeply about. And I didn't understand the topic. That's another thing. You should understand the details of what the game is about, but I just thought I was going to, basically give a thumbs up for somebody else's report. And so I didn't, I sort of kind of phoned it in up until that point. I learned my lesson on that, never phone it in. And because of that, because I didn't understand it, I said, hey, if you guys come and bring a steno pad with you and take a bunch of notes for your own command, I want to just have a conversation with you at the end where you can tell me, sort of explain to me what happened in your own terms. And so that I've got a little bit going in when I read the report. You know, I have to give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. So you can tell me a little bit about it so I can do a better job of the thumbs up or thumbs down. And those notebooks ended up being the core of the data of the report, that and the stuff that came from PowerPoint slides. But their write-ups were critical for me being able to do anything other than just sputter for 40 pages. So I got lucky in that regard. But one of the things I took away from that is always have an analysis plan. Always, even if all the analysis plan is like how you could do the game better, you should always have an analysis plan. Okay, let's see. Let's go to, and you know what? One more thing on this. I'm not really going to talk about the psychology of how analysis works, but a CIA analyst, one of the names to conjure with in McLean is a guy named Richards J. Hewer Jr. Not Richard, Richards, which is the sort of name that CIA people have. And he wrote a book called Psychology of Intelligence Analysis that is required reading in the intelligence community, and it's brilliant. And the intelligence community spends more time thinking about how do I know that than any other community I've ever been associated with. And that book is available for free as a PDF. You can download it. Don't pay for it. Don't pay for it. There's people who sell it, but you can get it as a PDF and download it. It's a fantastic book about how the human mind works and what implications that has for how you know things. Okay, let's talk about culture and environment. Games take place within a cultural and environmental context. It takes place within the real world. And those real world considerations can affect the game. By affect, I mean limit game design and gameplay. It's largely impossible to eliminate the effects of culture, but at the very least, you can document it and try to compensate for it to the best that you can. So like one way that this can happen is that like you don't necessarily have real red players. Like to give an example near and dear to my heart, what you really want to have is people who understand how red works playing red, and they need to be operators for whatever the red operators are. So let's just pick something at random. Say it's red airplanes, right? It's an air thing, right? So it's a fighter thing. So you want to have red fighter pilots is really who you'd want to have. You need people who think like red and people who think like fighter pilots. You can get one or the other here. You can't really get both very easily. If that guy exists, I've never met him. You can get people who think like red. They're intelligence analysts, and they can at least tell you what red's thinking. But they're generally not operators. They only know how fighter stuff works to the degree that they know it from analyzing the red stuff, right? So I really want a Chinese F-15 pilot. That guy doesn't exist. I can choose either an F-15 pilot or a guy who knows something about China. Yeah, Sarah says we need a People's Liberation Army Air Force defector. I did actually know a People's Liberation Army ground guy defector once when I was up in Newport. We actually wrote an article together about Chinese aircraft carriers, and that really helped because he spoke in red Chinese and sort of could tell me what was important and what isn't. And I speak and read aircraft carrier, and I think it was a wonderful pairing. But those guys are hard to find. And so personally, I'm of the opinion that if I get to choose between having an operator and having a guy who has knowledge of red, I want the operator. Because a blue operator playing red and the blue operator knows blue he can at least point to the holes in blue and exploit the holes in blue. And I, in the analysis section, can point out the caveat, we don't actually have a red operator. The closest we can do is a blue operator who knows how to do all the stick and rudder stuff and knows air tactics, combined with some knowledge of red we got from some intel guys. I can sort of run that through and explain to you exactly how you should think about that data and put the appropriate caveats on it. And that's indeed what we did with Halsey Alpha, because everybody playing that game was a blue guy. Even the red guys were really blue guys at heart. But you know, they knew where the bodies were buried on their own tactics and on their own weapon system. So we always were careful to say, this is not what we think would be the way that red would necessarily do it. But we know that if red knew as much about our systems as we did, this is a way that they could try to exploit our vulnerabilities. And that's about the best that you can do in that situation. So, I'll point back to Millennium Challenge 02 again, that there was really sort of a cultural clash between General Van Riper and JFCOM in terms of how this should happen, how this game should go down. And, you know, and there was just so much politics involved with that. It was embedded in this larger culture of how we're going to totally redo the US Armed Forces for the 21st century. And it just got so big and ugly and hairy, and you know, it's too big to fail and all the rest of it, that all that came crashing down on that game. In retrospect, it's hard to look at that game and think of how it could be anything other than a total cluster, because it just had so many things going against it. And so, you know, that's kind of how I've come to view that game, is that there's certainly lessons to be learned, and one of the lessons is don't ever do that again. Don't ever let a game get that big again. Let's talk about audience a little bit. And I see that there's a few questions here and there. I'm trusting that Sebastian at the end is going to be able to tell me, to read all the questions to me rather than me having to go back and find them. I've seen Sebastian do it again before, and I have no doubt he's going to do it again. So let's talk about the audience. Non-participants who will be interested in the game or the game analysis. And the failure mode is just that the knowledge of the larger audience can sometimes inhibit gameplay. And I don't really have a specific example of this. It just happens all the time. Because one of the things that you see is just that, you know, this is why war games have non-attribution rules. You got to be careful about who you let in the room and how you report on the games afterwards. One of the, you know, most games have this rule that says you don't mention people by name. And you'll note that the only two people I've mentioned by name in this entire thing are General Van Riper, who, you know, you can read about it all over the newspapers, and me. And that's because you don't talk about the people, because part of the deal is you don't talk about the names of the individual people, because that can affect gameplay. That's really something you need to be aware of. This is probably more of an analytic thing, but it's something I did want to mention at some point, is that I think that the analyst has 3 objectives in their report. Those objectives are to caveat the results, document, but caveat the results. And I put it that way because war game results, the more important the game, the faster the game results get out there, because players will go and say, yeah, I was there and I saw this happen and it means X. And people will kind of figure out, you know, they'll hear the broad parameters. So you need to basically say, no, here's exactly what happened and here's what didn't happen. So document and caveat the results, highlight the subtle, highlight the things that are going to be missed in all the big picture fray, and squash the irrationally exuberant, because people are going to come out saying this proved our concept, and war games don't prove anything. They may give you hints. War games whisper to you about answers. They do not prove anything. They provide insight, not answers. And so you need to make sure that you have it on record, those statements. with regard to this particular game, because trust me, people are going to come back and say, we went to Newport and the analysis proves that. And it's like, no, it didn't. Your impression proves that, proves in quotes, but the analysis didn't. All right, let's talk about the executing authority. We're getting close to the end, actually. This is the last one of the big picture ones, last of the game elements. Executing authority, there's two authorities to worry about. One is the sponsor, and one is your own chain of command. And yes, even if it's composed of wargamers. When I was in Newport, my boss was, well, in theory, he was a wargamer. He'd been in the wargaming department. And his boss had been the head of the wargaming department before he got promoted. This should be nirvana, right? These are guys that get it, right? Yeah, not so much, not so much. Failure mode here is a lack of support or unrealistic expectations. And to some degree, this is because they're actually not very good at their job. And to some degree, it's because they're dealing with a bunch of stuff that you don't have to worry about, or there's political ramifications of what's going on, and there's pressure in different things or whatever. I was involved with a game report. It was for one of the globals. The first of those two globals I mentioned, not the second, the first chronologically, not the one with the admiral. So I wrote an analysis. I was the lead analyst. I wrote an analysis plan that was completed before the event was executed. The boss signed off on said analysis plan. There was a list of milestones where it's post-game. We've collected all the data. We're executing the milestones. One of the things about this was that I had a problem in that it was looking at a bunch of different countries and trying to sort of collect a bunch of data, and you really kind of wanted the data to be coded the same way. There was coding that had to happen. And if you've ever had a social science research class, you understand that having people reading documents and coding statements that were not like a Likert scale or something like that, that's actually that's a trick. Getting everybody to do it the same way is a trick. And so my solution to that was, I'll do it all. I'm going to look through all the data. I'm going to work nights and weekends. I'm going to do it. I may need some help with the write-up afterwards, but I'm going to do it. That was the plan from day one. And we specifically talked about it. How are you going to do this? I'm going to do it. There's still the danger that for an individual researcher that your perspective changes over time. So it's always useful to go back and sort of reread some of the old stuff and go, am I still coding this the same way? And it also helps that because this is a war game, this is closer to being historical analysis than it is to being strictly scientific analysis. It's not science because you are not following the scientific method when you do this, which is not to say that it's not analysis. So, but it did mean that I wasn't worried about things to the right of the decimal point in that. And so the easiest solution was for me to do it all. The boss, during one of these routine status reports where I explain, here's the list of milestones, I am right on track. He gets impatient and he says, we're going to add more analysts to do this to make it go faster. And I said, boss, that's not going to make it go faster. It's going to make it go slower because I need to get everybody up to speed. I'm going to need to spend a bunch of time double checking everybody else to make sure that we are all on the same page. And oh, by the way, we're going to get a less precise answer because it's going to be too hard to really coordinate that in the time we've got. So it's going to be a less precise answer generated slower. I was told I did not know what I was talking about and that we're going to do it his way. All right, he's the boss. We did it his way. It took longer and gave us a less precise answer, which I was then told was my fault because it was my analysis plan. And I did not, and it couldn't possibly be that he had called an audible on the analysis plan in the middle of crossing the stream. It had to be that I didn't do it right. Did I mention that this boss had virtually no real wargaming experience and spent all of his time denigrating the experience of anybody who did? He used to say that experience that you got before you came to Newport didn't count because what you did in Newport was so different that only Newport experience accounted. And that's because if you didn't do that, then he was like the least experienced member of the wargaming staff, despite the fact that he was the boss. It would be more accurate to say that the Wargames in Newport were kind of weird in that they were really big, and as a result, it actually worked the other way. General wargaming experience was useful. Specifically, Newport wargaming experience does not transfer to as many other places just because of the specific details. If you only learned their system, you haven't learned general wargame design. So that's how that worked. Okay, so next slide is some thoughts about distributed wargaming. And it's kind of the elephant in the room right now because all of us professionals that are having to do this are having to do it remotely. And that means either doing it through NIPRNet, the unclassified internet like we are here, or through SIPRNet, secret internet, or maybe even a higher network. And the higher you go, at least if you go to SIPRNet, you have a lot less tools that you can use and a lot more restrictions. And those are what we call in the business high demand, low density assets. It's tough to get time in there. Very few people can say, by the way, I'm going to need to take over your SIPR vault for the next 2 weeks. I need to have, VTC capability from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. for the next 2 weeks. As a general rule, they'll just laugh at you. There's lots of opportunities for failure in trying to do distributed wargaming these days. So I just talked about one. Resources is a big deal. The facilities piece of it that I talked about. To paraphrase Clausewitz, in distributed wargaming, everything is easy, but even the easy things are hard. So you can go through and think in terms of the facilities, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of that stuff is sort of standardized. Like you have to get everything onto a SIPR computer, and that can be tough to actually move it onto it. Everything gets harder. I've been pounding the drum that we need to relearn how to do a lot of the things that we're really good at now, because it's a different environment. And we may be good at getting the data onto SIPR, but talking through SIPR all the time is hard, right? We are able to abstract a lot of things by having those two guys in the same room have the conversation, right? So that models we model a whole bunch of comm channels just by having people have a conversation like two normal human beings do. You'll note that in this particular thing, this isn't really a conversation. This is me talking and you listening. What if all of us had to contribute other than through chat? How do you do that? You can't really have a 24-person, 48-person, however many people are there, conversation, in a VTC. In the real world, when you're all in the same room, you can go, hey, Bob, come over here. I need to talk to you. So you may have 40 people in a room, but you don't have 40 people engaged in a conversation at the same time, generally. What you have is either it's more of a, one person talking, everybody listening, or they're broken up into subgroups. How do you recreate that when you're all in different rooms? Those solved problems that we don't re-examine will kill us in trying to do this stuff. You need to go through and question all the assumptions. Why does it have to be 9 to 5? Why does it have to be 5 days in a row? Why does it have to be, how am I going to, you say that we're going to talk. How exactly am I going to do that? Well, it's like, are we going to have a phone conversation? Well, does everybody have access to a secure phone? Is the secure phone in the same room or is it in a different room? If it's in a different room, how do I know which one to be on? You got to start as if you've never done this before and ask questions about every single piece of it, if for no other reason to confirm that, no, you do understand the implications of it. And I'm seeing that a lot in the games that I've been involved in, is that people aren't necessarily doing that sort of thing. The ad hoc communications are especially easy to overlook. It's really easy to say, well, I talked to Bob. It's like, well, just talk to Bob. Or it's like, how many times do you have a conversation with Bob at the war game that you don't even really think about the fact that you had that conversation with Bob? You think in terms of, my deliverable is this PowerPoint slide deck that has the plan that we're going to execute, or this Excel spreadsheet or whatever. But the rest of it, you don't necessarily think about. You have to. Friction becomes time. Don't assume that you understand how long these things will take, because the one thing across the board that I am willing to sort of write, I'm willing to carve this statement in stone, and that is, anything that you have to do is going to be less efficient than two people having a conversation in person. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't work it to your advantage. Like, we're doing this distributed. We got people spread out all over. You got people in Hawaii, you've got people here. We don't overlap. Oh shit, that's a problem. We don't overlap. Oh, wait a minute. We don't overlap, which means there are times where I can be doing stuff that they're not there. There's times that they can be doing stuff, we can do stuff early in the morning before they arrive. They can do stuff late in the day before we arrive, which basically means we've just made the work day longer without anybody working more hours. Okay, what if we split the days up? So like maybe we don't play Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Maybe we play Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Or Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Thursday, to have work days in between all of them. In which case you can go and cycle and do stuff, right? So you can make this work to your advantage, but if all you're doing is reproducing processes that you currently do, friction becomes time, and you need to understand that. Like I said, there's lots of opportunities for success as well, right? So think about how you can make this work to your advantage. So I do have an example for this, and that is a couple of examples that are both sort of the same idea, and that's the idea of putting a game board up on a display and letting people look at it. So I've done a bunch of stuff with Command PE. I'm going to give an example that Sarah Folks was there watching when it happened, so I guess now I've mentioned a third person in a game. One of the things about doing stuff in Command PE is a wonderful app. It allows you to do some really seriously cool things, and especially if you understand its limitations, it is a godsend. And because it's a computer program and you can throw the display up on the wall, that's great. The problem is that you've only got one display. And you've got people that need to look at that display, and some of the people are going to care about parts of the display that are different from what the other people care about. So you can only focus in on one part of the display at any given time, because it's really a single player game, or it's a single computer game. It's not multiplayer. And the big limitation of that is, because of that, I can only focus on one part at a time. So I can either do the big picture view, in which everything is very small, even when projected up on a wall. Or I can focus in on something, and there's always somebody else going like, but I can't see the part that I need, right? I've seen the exact same thing happen in a game that I played with Merle Robinson, who's also on here, and I don't think Mike Erickson is, but my colleague Mike Erickson was part of this game too, who played a game called Rise and Fall. It was done in Cyberboard, which is a blast from the past. And we really were just using it as the board map. It didn't have any sort of AI or it didn't enforce any rules. It was just a display, and we played over Skype, and Mike shared the display. And when it was Merle's turn, Merle could say, focus in on this part, that's where I'm playing. When it was my turn, I could focus in on my part. But it didn't mean that there were times where I wanted to do some planning on, when Merle's moving and he's on the other side of the map fighting some barbarians, and I want to be on my side doing some planning, and I can't because I can't see the map. Now, in that particular case, that was actually relatively easy to solve. And if we play that game again, I've already told Mike, I need, PowerPoint, Cyberboard, something. I need the map. You need to send the map out to everybody in advance so that I can at least track stuff on my map. Maybe, or I've got the map. Maybe I need to move counters. I bought the physical game. Maybe I need to set that up and move stuff around. I need to have my own display. I don't have an answer for the Command PE one, except maybe this multiplayer version of it the Marines are funding. That might be the way that you have to go about doing that. But that's one of the things about having an actual physical map that you put out on a table. You can have a ton of people clustered around that map, and they can all care about the same thing, or they can all care about their own different things, and they can all be working around it at the same time. So don't just assume that because you can throw a map on a display that it's the same thing as having a map on a table, because it's not. This is also one of the reasons why you play test. You learn these things through play testing. Okay, so some concluding thoughts. Always re-examine your assumptions. Now especially, because all of your assumptions are currently wrong within this world of distributed wargaming. Always re-examine your assumptions. Periodically just go through and start from the list, make a list of the assumptions and go through them again. It's okay if you get the same answer that you did the last time. That doesn't mean that it was a wasted effort. It means that you have a higher confidence that you haven't missed something. Get the sponsor to agree to things in writing. One of the problems that one of the failure modes that you have with very senior sponsors is they will tell their prophet, the chief of staff, who will come down from the mountain and tell you what the boss wants. Maybe the first meeting you meet with the boss and he tells you what they want, but from ever after you're talking with the prophet or one of the prophet's minions. The number of times when you finally get in to see the sponsor and you say, boss, this is what we're going to do for you. And the sponsor looks at you and goes, that's not what I want. When what you just said to him was word for word from the chief of staff. Because a lot of times the underlings won't go back to the boss. I've seen lots of instances with flag officers where the underlings spend inordinate amounts of time going, what do you think he meant when he said this? When it's like, just ask him. Oh, we can't do that. You can't go and ask the admiral that. Yeah, you can. You should. You don't understand, you should, right? Rather than just make this stuff up. Remember, the admiral used to be in your position too. He's had this, doing the divination, doing the magic 8-ball, trying to figure out what the boss, this isn't new to him. He understands that this is how it works. Ask him. Be realistic about what you can do. 7-minute turns, not realistic. Taking a game design that you had previously done and just sort of like magically fairy dusting away the fact that you've now added this big communications piece in the middle, not particularly realistic. Plan for failures. Hopefully they won't happen, but the more you plan for failures, the better that you will be able to respond to failures when they happen. If you can, have a plan B. Collect all the data twice, if you can. Works great to do all that stuff. Document the process. You'll need it for the report. It'll make it easier the next time. When you write it down, that's when you have a tendency to think of stuff, right? That's when you can think of stuff. And finally, you can never have too many office supplies. And I'm seriously not joking when I say that. That is not a throwaway line. The number of times I've been in a war game and somebody said, you know what, let's just do a sticky drill. And they've started throwing stickies up on the wall. Or they want, we need a whiteboard, or we need a big paper pad, and easel. So give them a paper pad and easel. Give them stickies. When they put the stickies down, ask that they put them on the easel. Then take a piece of tape and tape them all to that piece of paper, and take that piece of paper with you when you collect all the data. Because, yeah, maybe they're going to give you a product at the end, right? They're going to process stuff. But it's useful to have that other stuff there. Also, have a guy in a room with a notebook. If nothing else, that guy in the room can tell you, that's where you learn things like, this Bob Smith guy was such an asshole that everybody stopped. Everybody else basically checked out. And what you really got there were Bob Smith's views on stuff, not everybody's views on it. Or early on, the 06 basically reminded everybody that he's an 06, and all the 03s started just deferring to him. You don't get that stuff from the stylized products that you ask them to produce. You get that from a body in a room writing in a notebook, or it can be typing on a computer, but you need to have an observer to capture stuff like that. And make sure that they all have plenty of office supplies. So that is the end of my talk. I'll leave this slide up for a little bit so that people can see it. And Sebastian, start asking me questions.
Hey, Chris, great job. So one of the first questions—
Sorry, it was so long, everybody.
Yeah, no worries. Do you feel like computers have a role in helping address the complexity problem?
Yes. They also contribute to it. They help address the complexity problem in a couple of ways. First of all, there's two different ways a computer can be part of a war game. You can be playing the game on the computer, or the computer can provide you with tools that you use, right? So like the data collector can be typing in a Word document. The players can have their data in the form of spreadsheets or web pages or whatever. They can be putting stuff in spreadsheets or PowerPoint slides or whatever. You can have display software that allows everybody to see stuff. You can have email software that you can use to send stuff back and forth to people. That's not really playing the game in the computer. That's using the computer to play what might be a manual game. Or you can have, you know, something like Command PE, where you're actually playing the game in the computer, or JSAF, or one of those other things. They add to the complexity, though, is that a lot of these games are not, there's this tendency to treat operational and above, the operational level of war and above, as being just lots and lots of tactical. And that's a problem, in that now you've got to manage this big picture that's going on. Like JSAF is a Joint Semi-Automated Forces, which is something we had up in Newport. The problem with JSAF is you needed warfare trained guys in all the different areas. If you wanted to put buoys, it's theoretically an operational level game, but if you want to put buoys in the water from a P3, you had to put individual splash marks for all the buoys. That's very time consuming, and you need a guy who knows what he's doing. I don't want that. I want a game that's at the, for that type of problem, that's at the operational level, where I can say, I want this area sanitized. Tell me what I need to do it, right? I'm going to draw an area. Tell me how sanitized I can get it, what the resource expenditure is going to be to get it to the level that I need it to be. Or, you know, I put this asset in it, tell me what I end up with there, right? For that level of sanitization. I don't want something, if it requires 50 people to run the game, that's way too complicated. It's way too hard to make that work, and it's got too many failure modes associated with it. The other thing is that if you're rolling your own software, or even if you're not, you know, software stuff takes time. And if you're playing a manual game, like a seminar game or a board game or something like that, and you discover something isn't working, you can call an audible and just sort of say, you know what, we're going to do X. But if you discover that something's not working in your computer-based game, it's a lot harder to do that. And it's a black box. The players don't necessarily know that something isn't working. You, the adjudicator, might, or white cell person, might not know it's not working. So I am not against using computers. We use Command PE all the time. Command PE is great. There's other things that do similar things. But, you know, the right tool for the right job, right? Sometimes the right answer, sometimes you really do have a nail and a hammer really is the right thing. But you should have other tools in your toolkit. Next question.
So Chris, the next one is in reference to the Cold War game you referenced. It's a quick question. Did the Soviets end up winning?
I don't know. I can't remember. I think the answer is that blue ended up winning, but it, you know, it wasn't necessarily the blue was winning, but, right? You've basically destroyed the current international order in the process. Now you can make the argument that if the US and the Soviets ever actually went to war, and all you ended up with was a destroyed international order, you're probably doing pretty good. But I really need to come up with a better example than that, because it's, on the one hand, it's got a lot of salience. On the other hand, it may be apocryphal, and there needs to be a little bit more detail to answer questions like this. Next.
Have you tried hosting a scenario or game design at a wargaming convention to see how hobby gamers would handle the game outside of your typical military or government players?
No, the closest I've seen is that there are people who have experience in both, who have done both. For instance, I don't know if you know Sean Barnett, who is a fellow RAND person.
Sean is great.
Yeah, Sean, I've known Sean since the early to mid 1990s. And he and I were both in the same wargaming group until we all sort of moved away. And I get together and wargame at his place all the time when I'm not locked in my apartment because of a pandemic. And you know, he's someone, he's run games professionally, he's run games at cons, but he has a tendency to run different games when he does that. You know, they're not the same game. Dan McDonough of the National Security Decision Making game was a Newport trained wargamer, and NSDM is basically Dan taking a Newport game, running it through the hobby converter, and turning it into something that you can play at cons. So he basically created a Paul Mill game designed to be played at cons. But you know, one of the important things to remember in all of that is that when you're doing a hobby game, the objective is to have fun. And it might have subsidiary objectives that say, let's teach some people some things in the process, and let's try to be as realistic as we can for some value of realism. But it really is about having fun. I wouldn't say that that professional games can totally divorce the idea of fun, because if you do that, then you start running into player engagement problems. A bored player is a dangerous player, right? Bored players start doing the sort of player equivalent of sticking forks in power outlets, and that's bad for everybody. Or they'll start doing stuff just to be disruptive, which is bad for everybody. Or, you know, they won't give their best, right? That's a failure mode too, is if the players are just phoning it in. It's like, you know, we didn't ask you to come here and to phone it in. We seriously want you here to do your best, right? So players in professional games, you still have to think about player fun, but you've got this other set of objectives that are really what you're trying to accomplish that would really kind of be an alien beast if you did it at a hobby convention. The closest thing I can think of, and it's not very close, is when I was at CNA, I was involved with a project called Scud Hunt, where we designed a very, very simple game that we had people play, and it was played distributedly. And the goal was to have people play this game so we could collect data about them playing the game and about we gave them different communications tools, and how did those communication tools affect their ability to play the game. It wasn't it wasn't at a hobby convention. It wasn't a for fun game, but we purposely tried to make it sort of a cartoony fun game. And we also made a point of not telling them about why we were asking them to play this game until after they were done playing it. And then we said, okay, this is why you were doing this. That's the closest I've got. Next.
What types of analysis do you usually do, and what elements of it comprise an analysis plan?
How much time do we have? That's a big question. But let me take a stab at it. And this is one of those places, remember how early on I said that, you know, where you sit is where you stand. So I did my formative wargaming at Newport and CNA. CNA, we did board game type stuff. I did a lot of hobby board gaming. We'd occasionally do things that were like different types of games, but like seminar type games, but those were rarer during the time I was there, although CNA's done a bunch of those, and I did a few while I was there. But we actually did some board and card game type stuff. At the Naval War College, almost everything was a seminar game, and the one example of a board game was a game that you had like teams playing. So it effectively was a seminar game, even though it had counters and pieces and stuff like that. So, so those all had a tendency to be very qualitative. The only real quantitative thing was that Scud Hunt thing I just told you about, which is we were basically tracking how well particular communication tools resulted in their situational awareness as exemplified by them being able to find the Scuds and kill them in this game. And so there was a lot of experimental design to make sure that we weren't jacking it up by having everybody play the same, same order, and how many different runs do we need before we have a minimum data set where we can statistically say things about it and stuff like that. Other parts of the world do very, very quantitative type games. You can get lots of data on expenditures and this and that and the other thing. I have a tendency to be really kind of skeptical of things that are very quantitative, because I think that's more of a simulation type thing. That's more like load it into AFSIM and run it 10,000 times and come back with a graph that tells you what the results look like over time, and then you can dive deep in the that's really interesting. Why is it shaped that way? And then you can dive deep into that to figure out why it's shaped that way. Usually what you're talking about especially in a seminar war game, is human decision making, right? And so you're trying to understand why things happen the way they did. I always say that if I give the players a new whiz bang and the whiz bang turns out to be the key, that's kind of boring, right? I gave them the whiz bang because I thought the whiz bang was going to be the key. If I give them a new whiz bang and it turns out that the new whiz bang had absolutely no effect, or the players saw no reason to use the whiz bang, that's interesting. One of the things that we did a bunch of times when I was up in Newport is we did games that were designed to support organizational structures. And by that I mean, how are we going to organize this new command? And so what we would do is we'd give them an organizational structure and a scenario to go along with it, and have them be the various pieces of it. And then the organizational structure was printed out on big sheets along the wall. And everybody was like, go and make changes. Go up and if you think something's wrong, if you think there needs to be a line connecting two boxes that we don't have a line connecting, connect them. Write a little explanation next to it of why you think that. And so in those cases, the scenario was really something to get them thinking about this other thing, which sort of means that we were doing second level analysis, right? The first level of analysis is coming from the players. Because we're asking their opinion on, now that you've played this game, what do you think about that thing? And then we would sort of pull it all together and put it together and analyze it. The data collection analysis piece of it is hard. There's a very interesting process called the language processing method that we always try. We had this love affair with the language processing method when I was up there, because it's fantastic. It lets you drill down on a particular subject, and by the time you are done with that, you understand exactly what the player experience was and why they did things and what their opinion is, et cetera, et cetera. And the only problem is that 4 players could analyze one declarative problem, and it only took them 4 hours to do it. So it just wasn't practical to do it on a regular basis. I was part of one war game that did it. It was great. For the one global, we actually took the language processing method and turned a very simplified version of it into the core mechanic of the game. And so that's the one where I threw away a bunch of the data. And we had them do a sticky drill and sort of do it with a process where they put a bunch of stickies up early on, and then they had to filter them and group them and categorize them, et cetera, et cetera. And then we collected all of that. And that was the core mechanism that allowed them to come to a conclusion, but also, we turned them into the data collectors. I'm actually quite proud of that. That was my idea, and we had been banging our heads against the wall for about a week when I said, why don't we just use LPM? Simplify it and do that. So. Next question.
So I have 2 short questions for you. One is from unrelated about your presentation, but some of the people in our audience are thinking about setting up wargaming clubs of their own at their universities, and they want to know some of the recommendations you would have for their wargaming collection when they begin.
Ooh, boy. I'm not as conversant with what's currently in print as I would like to be. Um, I actually suspect that you might be able to answer that one better than I can at this point, Sebastian. Because I see.
Honestly, I would recommend everyone who's interested in commercial gaming for education to look at James Sterrett's past webinar for Goose on
Yes.
the YouTube page, and he does a great job. And he can toss in some recommendations, and he recommends. I know he uses lots of games via Vassal, but also board game versions. But for me, I'll have the reservation of asking the final question for tonight, which is, you talked about a lot about the pathologies of analytical gaming, but are there different pathologies and how do they differ, or how are they the same for educational gaming?
So I would love to, I can give you my thoughts on that. I'd love to see James Sterrett uh, or Mike Dunn or the two of them do a tag team presentation on that, because I'm sure they've seen I'm sure they have examples of how things have gone off the rails that are different than the examples that I would come up with. I'd start off by saying that, I went through the elements of game design, and a lot of those, if you go through my paper, don't you always hate it when people at presentations say, you should just go read my work? You should go read my work. Because I try to go through and do sort of a more in-depth look at all the different elements of a war game, and try to come up with as many different questions about how things can go wrong. And so a lot of the things there are pretty standardized, right? Every war game has a database, and as a result, the database can be wrong, or you can have a problem with it from an educational standpoint. I think one of the fundamental ones that James and Mike would probably sign up to, because I've heard them talk about it in the past, is that if you got a bunch of players that have disparate levels of war game experience, and they're there because it's part of a degree program or something like that. In other words, you can't take advantage of the fact that they've all self-selected because they're all grognards and they've been doing it forever. You can run into problems where you'll bring out something that you think is easy, and they don't get it. They don't get it. It's too hard in the time you've got. We had to design a game. There's a game called Sea Powers, which I'm actually currently, even as we speak, I'm working on getting it ready for publication. It's a game that we being CNA, did for the Naval War College, for some people that were at the Naval War College. They actually were not really part of it. The CNO Strategic Studies Group. This is a bunch of 06s, so Navy captains, Marine colonels. There may have been a Coastie there also. Heavy hitters, heavy hitters. This is the group that came up with network-centric warfare back in the day. And these are also the guys that in a previous incarnation were basically the guys that came up with the 1980s maritime strategy. So a bunch of really heavy hitters. Like half of these guys make flag officer, right? The normal promotion rate's what, 5%? Half of these guys make flag officer. And so we've got to do a game for them on innovation. Al Nofi was the CNA rep up there. He calls us up and he says, hey, I think a game could be useful, a game on some sort of innovation topic. And I said, you mean like the pre-World War I naval arms race? And he goes, yeah, that'd be great. And the reason why I said that is I'd been thinking about doing a game on that for like 2 years at that point. This is right about the time of 9/11, if I remember correctly. I think we did our first trip to Newport to talk with him about it, like right after 9/11. And so we're going to do this game on the World War I naval arms race. Now, we have to assume that none of these guys are wargamers. We've got about 4 hours to play it to completion twice and teach them how to play. And in the end, they should have learned something about innovation. Yeah, that was kind of hard. Now we got a game that we think worked. in that regard. It was an interesting design experience because we ended up borrowing, because of the way that the funding works, you know, anybody who works for an organization like RAND or CNA, et cetera, knows that there is no such thing as working off the clock. And so because we were running out of money, we ended up borrowing a system from another game. We borrowed the combat system from a game called Ivanhoe, which is a GMT card game about medieval jousting. And I can say for a fact that the Ivanhoe system is just an accurate representation of World War I naval combat as it is of medieval jousting. But it gave us a system that was already play tested, and then we could concentrate on the pre-war part, which was where all the innovation happened. And we were able to pull that together and do it, but we had this constraint where we couldn't, you know, we didn't have any background on any of these players, and we kind of just had to assume that it was going to be a smart guy who wandered in off the street. And we were able to make that work. We later ended up that we executed that game like a total of 3 or 4 times, and in future years, we moved it to the very first week that they were there because we discovered it's an excellent ice-breaking opportunity for these guys. And so they asked us, can you guys do this rather than wait until we get to the innovation thing? Can you do it early as an icebreaker? And so we did, like I said, I think we did that 3 times for them. Worked really well.
Well, Chris, I want to thank you for giving such a great presentation. I know lots of people already asked when the link will be up in the chat. This will be uploaded to our YouTube channel probably in the next 24 hours. And lastly, I want to thank Chris for his wonderful presentation, and thank you all for your participation. See you next week.
Sebastian, please do not close the window yet, because